The music at the rehearsal dinner was too loud for real conversation, which suited everyone just fine. Tara floated from table to table like she already had a crown on her head. I waited by the corner of the room, holding the small velvet box in both hands, like it might vanish if I let go. When she finally came over, I smiled and offered it to her. "This belonged to Julian's great-grandmother," I said. "It's been passed down through the women in our family. I wanted you to have it." Tara opened the lid and stared at the ring. Thin gold, a small sapphire in the center, modest but full of history. She gave a tight smile, the kind that barely moved her face. Then she leaned in close, her voice barely above a breath. "Tomorrow you're no longer family. We've already taken your name off the program." I blinked. For a moment I thought I'd misheard her, but she was already turning away, thanking someone else for a gift, laughing like she hadn't just gutted me with a whisper. Julian was across the room, standing stiffly beside her father. He caught my eye just for a second and looked away. Not a word, not a signal. Just a man choosing silence over a mother. I closed the box, slipped it back into my purse. My fingers trembled as I fastened the clasp. Someone clinked a glass for a toast. I didn't hear the words. I sat back down, my hands folded in my lap, my name burning a hole in the air. I stayed until the dessert tray passed untouched, then quietly made my exit. The parking lot was cold. I didn't bother with my coat. I needed the sting of the air to remind me I was still here, still someone. I drove home in silence, but by the time I pulled into the driveway, I already knew what I had to do. The house was too quiet when I got home, the kind of quiet that feels more like judgment than peace. I walked straight to the laundry room and pulled the warm linens from the dryer. They smelled faintly of lavender and starch. I had spent the afternoon before the rehearsal prepping the guest room just in case anyone from Julian's side needed a place to stay. But Tara had waved it off. "We've already arranged a suite for the real guests." The words still clung to me like damp fabric. I folded the sheets neatly, pressing each crease like it might bring order to the parts of me unraveling. I walked across the hall to the room I'd made ready. Pillows fluffed, fresh flowers by the window, a stack of clean towels on the bench, still untouched, still unnecessary. Then I saw the quilt folded at the edge of the bed. Julian's quilt, dark blue stars stitched into soft cotton, little pieces of old flannel pajamas and worn-out shirts sewn in square by square. I remembered staying up 3 nights straight finishing the binding so he could take it to his first summer camp. He cried that night, said it smelled like home. I told him it was made to remind him of exactly that. Now he was marrying someone who didn't want that version of him to exist, someone who wanted clean lines and new stories, no reminders, no wrinkles, no mothers. I ran my hand across the stitching. One of the stars was loose. I could have fixed it, but I didn't. I stood there for a long time, holding the past in my fingers, the thread barely hanging on. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard the heater click off. I left the room and shut the door behind me. Not gently, not this time. I almost didn't go. I could have mailed the cufflinks or sent a message through Julian. But something in me needed to see the space again with new eyes. Maybe, or just with mine, fully open this time. The church was already decorated. Soft white drapery hung from the ceiling beams, and rows of chairs were lined up like soldiers awaiting instruction. I found the wedding planner near the front, mid-conversation with a florist. When she saw me, she smiled automatically, not remembering who I was. I held up the small box. Julian forgot these, his great-grandfather's cufflinks. She took them politely, thanked me, and turned back toward the slideshow projection flickering across the altar wall. I stood in place as photo after photo cycled through. Tara in a dozen white dresses at bridal boutiques, laughing beside her sisters, twirling in fields. Julian showed up less often, always next to her, always looking staged. Then came a photo I recognized, Julian's college graduation. The moment was burned into my memory, not because of the cap and gown, but because I'd nearly passed out in the heat after hours on my feet, snapping photos, holding flowers, hauling his robe in a garment bag through 3 buses. In the original picture, Julian had one arm around me, the other holding his diploma. I remembered his smile that day, but now the version on the screen had me cropped out completely. Just him, just the paper, just the part that fit the story. My mouth went dry. The planner must have noticed my stare because she said almost cheerfully, Tara wanted a clean aesthetic, no distractions. She meant the photos, but I felt the knife in the word. I nodded once, turned away, and walked straight back down the aisle. I once thought I'd walk with pride. When I stepped outside, the sunlight hit cold against my face. I didn't bother to wipe the tear that slipped down. It wasn't new. By the time I got home, I knew I couldn't ignore that label any longer. I pulled the storage bin out, opened the lid, and reached for the folder marked Grayson. The box was heavier than I remembered. I dragged it from under the bench and set it on the carpet, my knees creaking as I sat cross-legged like a child at story time. The label on the side, closed cases, looked faded, as if even the ink wanted to forget. I lifted the lid and breathed in the dry scent of paper. Inside were old client folders, the detritus of a career spent sorting through other people's secrets. I thumbed past them until my fingers stopped at a thin blue file stamped Grayson. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen that name on a file in years. I opened it slowly, afraid of what might spill out. Photocopies of bank statements, trust agreements, and internal memos fanned across my lap. I'd handled this case at the firm, one of those quiet settlements where money moved like shadows and nothing went to trial. At the time, T. Grayson had been just another name in a stack. I never imagined it belonged to the woman my son would one day call his wife. As I read, the details returned like unwelcome guests. Shell companies registered to cousins, redacted names on wire transfers, a $200,000 payment to a nonprofit that dissolved 6 months later without filing its final report. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. I pushed the papers into a rough stack, then separated one memo from the rest. It was from an attorney. I remembered someone who bragged about getting blood from a stone. In the margin, a handwritten note. Ensure prenup clauses mirror trust language. The air in the room felt thinner. I sat back, gripping the edge of the folder. The pieces arranged themselves too neatly to ignore. Tara's family hadn't just brushed against trouble. They had lived in it. And Julian, blind in love, was about to sign his future into their hands. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay there with my eyes open, watching the ceiling shift as the hours passed. At dawn, I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, hands folded. There was no rage, no tears, just clarity. I opened my laptop and pulled the documents together. Every memo, every transaction, every connection I could still verify. I highlighted the details that mattered most: the timing of the trust, the closed nonprofit, the prenup language. Then I printed everything. No commentary, no cover letter, just facts. I slipped the pages into a manila envelope, sealed it shut, and wrote one line on the front: Julian, read before the vows. I dressed in navy slacks and a gray blouse, not black, not festive. Something quiet. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't fix my hair. My role in the spectacle was already erased, so I chose function over illusion. When I arrived at the church, guests were starting to trickle in. I didn't speak to anyone. I waited near the side entrance until I saw Father Delgado stepping out from the sacristy. He looked surprised to see me. "Ms. Myers," he said gently. I held out the envelope. "Please give this to Julian before the ceremony begins." He took it with hesitation. "Is this necessary?" I said, "And private." He read the name on the front. His brow furrowed, but he nodded. I thanked him and stepped back. I didn't go inside. I didn't wait to see the flowers or the dress or the seats I wouldn't sit in. I turned and walked down the church steps, the echo of heels on stone sounding like punctuation. The air outside was still, not yet heavy with the noise of celebration. I got in my car, folded my hands around the steering wheel, and sat for a moment. Then I started the engine and drove away. The envelope was no longer in my hands, but the weight of it was still in my chest. By the time they said, "Dearly beloved," I was already home. They told me later how it unfolded, piece by piece, like a tablecloth yanked from beneath fine china. Tara entered the chapel, beaming, arm in arm with her father, the hem of her gown skimming the aisle like it had somewhere better to be. Every guest turned to watch, cameras ready, eyes misty. Julian stood at the altar in a tailored gray suit, straight-backed, his smile a little too fixed. But Father Delgado didn't begin. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his vestment and pulled out the envelope I had given him. He leaned toward Julian and handed it to him discreetly. For a second, no one noticed. Then Julian's brows tightened as he opened the flap, pulling out the neatly clipped pages. He read the first 2 sheets. That's all it took. His face went gray. He folded the pages, slid them back into the envelope, and turned to Father Delgado. "I need a moment," he said, his voice low but clear. Tara's head whipped toward him. "What are you doing?" she hissed, still smiling at the crowd. Julian didn't answer. He stepped down from the altar and walked straight down the aisle, past the flowers, past the shocked faces, past the cameras still filming. The guests began to murmur, a ripple of confusion spreading in every direction. Tara's father stood frozen. Her mother reached for her arm. The pianist faltered, then stopped entirely. Outside, Julian scanned the courtyard, then the sidewalk, as if he expected to find me there waiting. But I was gone. Already home, shoes off, the television humming low in the background, though I wasn't watching. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee, staring at the grain in the wood. I didn't need to be there to see it. I knew how it would go. At 4:17 p.m., my phone lit up with a message from Elise. They called off the ceremony. Something happened at the altar. "You okay?" I didn't answer right away. I just sat with the silence. Then I stood and walked to the window as the phone started ringing. The call came 3 days later. No text ahead of time. Just his name flashing on the screen as if nothing had happened. I let it ring once, twice, then I answered. His voice was sharp, bruised, but still blaming. "You ruined everything," he said. No greeting, no pause. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. "No," I replied. "I gave you what you asked for, everything you needed to know." The silence on the other end wasn't heavy. It was hollow. He didn't ask how I found it. He didn't deny any of it. He didn't even ask if I was okay. It just hung there, breathing through clenched teeth. A son who'd just discovered his pedestal was never his to begin with. I waited a beat, then I hung up. There was no shaking in my hands when I grabbed my purse and keys. I didn't need time to think. I'd already done that. I drove straight to the bank I'd been with for 30 years and walked up to the counter where they still greeted me by name. "I need to update my estate records," I said. "Power of attorney, trust beneficiaries, all of it." It took 40 minutes. The banker didn't ask why. She just printed the forms, checked my ID, and slid the documents across the desk. I signed with steady strokes. Julian's name had once been printed in bold under every account that mattered. Retirement, property, even the cabin in the mountains he never bothered to visit. Now it vanished in under an hour. When I got home, I pulled out the copy of my will and slid the new version into the folder. The envelope from the wedding sat beside it, empty now but still whole. I left it there as a reminder, not of what I lost, but of what I reclaimed. I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, walked out to the porch, and sat with the evening air. It was quiet, not lonely, the kind of quiet that feels earned. The next morning, Elise knocked at my door with 2 muffins and a knowing look. We sat on the porch, the sun barely clearing the rooftops. Elise handed me a warm muffin and a paper napkin, folded into thirds, like we were kids at a lemonade stand again. I hadn't realized how much I needed the company until she sat down and said nothing for the first full minute. Then softly, "I saw the wedding online. People are calling it the walkout vows." I didn't laugh. I didn't flinch either. Just sipped my coffee and let it settle. She looked at me sideways. "You okay?" I nodded, then shook my head. "I don't know." Something opened then. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the smell of baked blueberries and sunlight. Maybe I just ran out of places to keep it all locked up. I told her about Julian, about raising him on my own after Randall left, about the nights I worked late shifts so tuition would be covered, about the way I sold my wedding ring to cover the deposit on his dorm. I wanted to give him everything, I said, and I thought I had. I gave him space, choices, a name he could be proud of. I gave him silence when he needed to feel like he was doing it all himself. Elise didn't interrupt. She just listened, hands curled around her mug like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "But I never thought," I continued, "that in doing all that, I'd erase myself from his story entirely." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Then maybe it's time to stop giving?" she said, "at least to people who don't look back." The breeze passed between us like punctuation. I stared down at the empty plate in my lap, the crumbs scattered like old intentions. Then I stood up, took the plates inside, and rinsed them clean. The law office smelled like leather and dry ink. I'd been there before, once when Randall and I first drafted a joint will, then again when I removed his name for good. This time I came alone, with a folder in hand and resolve stitched into every step. My attorney, Vanessa, greeted me with a warm but professional nod. She didn't ask questions. She'd known me long enough to read between silences. "I'd like to amend the beneficiary allocations," I said as we settled into the conference room. "Julian is no longer to be included." She nodded, unfazed. "And the new design?" I handed over a typed sheet. At the top, Myers Foundation, grant for single mothers-in-law. Below that, 3 organizations I'd supported quietly over the years, but never named in any official way. Now they'd carry a part of me forward. We went line by line, crossing out what no longer belonged, adding in what finally did. When the final draft slid across the table, I read it twice, then picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake when I signed. Later that afternoon, I opened the cedar chest in the hallway, the one Julian used to sneak into for Christmas clues, and pulled out the box that held his childhood toys: a fire truck missing a wheel, a wooden dinosaur, a crayon drawing of our backyard taped to the bottom of a tin lunchbox. I closed the lid gently and drove it to the local shelter without calling ahead. No ceremony, just a quiet letting go. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as I arranged 3 mismatched mugs on a tray. One for Elise, one for Marlene, the neighbor who always waved when she walked her dog, and one for me, the wide ceramic one Julian made in 3rd grade, the glaze uneven but the handle strong. I'd kept it tucked away for years, but today I brought it out. They arrived with a knock and the smell of cinnamon bread. Elise wore her usual windbreaker, even though the breeze was barely a whisper. Marlene brought flowers from her garden, zinnias, all color and no apology. We settled on the porch, the coffee hot, and the conversation easy. We didn't talk about the wedding, not directly. We talked about gardens that wouldn't bloom this year, about recipes gone wrong, about neighbors who left their trash bins out too long. Then Elise lifted her cup and said, "To women who survive the people who try to erase them." We clinked mugs gently. Marlene added, "And to starting over without asking for permission." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. It felt strange in my chest, like I'd forgotten how light could fit in there. My phone buzzed on the table beside us. I glanced at the screen. Julian again. No voicemail, just persistence. I flipped it over without checking the message, then reached for the coffee pot and poured us each another round. "This table's full," I said, settling into my chair, "with people who see me." They didn't need to say anything. They just sipped and stayed. That was enough. Later, after the mugs were rinsed and the porch was quiet again, I stepped back inside. I passed the shelf where the photo of Julian and me used to sit. I'd moved it weeks ago. Now there was a new frame in its place. An empty one. Not out of spite, out of space for whatever comes.